Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, July 5th, 2024, and after a week of constant conversation on the presidential level talking about the high-level Trump versus Biden, or potentially a Trump versus Harris matchup in this upcoming November election, I've decided today to talk about some pressing news from the North Carolina governor's race here, where the lieutenant governor, the Republican Mark Robinson, says, quote, "Some folks need killing." Now, I encourage you to watch the full context of the video that contains this clip. The clip of Mark Robinson talking about how political violence has long been utilized and violence in general in times of war and what many people see as a second American Revolution. A lot of the conversation we've been seeing had from the Heritage Foundation around the Project 2025 movement, calling it the Second American Revolution that will remain bloodless, if the left allows it to be, combined with comments like this one, have started to recirculate as this conversation that the Republican Party has been pushing around violence related to things like January 6th and violence related to our elections and our political process. Now, Mark Robinson is no stranger to controversial takes. He embraces it in full effect. Recent articles can show you that in the past, he downplayed allegations, downplayed things related to sexual assault, sexual abuse, anything related to domestic violence. Mark Robinson has not been there to meet that moment and has downplayed it at every step of the way. He also said that some women need to keep their skirt down, so they shouldn't be getting abortions. He makes comments that are so outlandish that they immediately become advertisements, and yet he remains to be one of the top-placed Republicans in the state of North Carolina. On top of that, an article released earlier on this year found out that Mark Robinson believed that we should go back to the America where women couldn't vote. One quick look at his Wikipedia page will reveal everything you need to know about the comments and the remarks and just generally the controversies that Mark Robinson has been in. Anti-Semitic remarks, Holocaust denial, anti-gay and transphobic comments, other controversial remarks. The list goes on and on and on. And so Mark Robinson, for all intents and purposes, is probably one of the least electable Republicans in the state of North Carolina for this governor election. And it looks like he is only piling on. By giving the Democratic Party such large ammunition to weaponize against him in this election, it makes him that much less likely to end up winning. Now, he didn't come into this race as the automatic favorite, but he did come into this race with a lot of name recognition, someone who was well known across the state, largely because of controversy, but still as the incumbent lieutenant governor. He's running against Josh Stein, who is the incumbent attorney general who won re-election back in 2020, and so for a while, this has been just Josh Stein, the attorney general, versus the lieutenant governor, the two top elected statewide officials besides the incumbent governor, who cannot run for re-election. It's a Democrat, Roy Cooper, here, and it looks like this showdown is going to be quite interesting. Now, what I've seen in all this conversation around the North Carolina governorship is that somehow this race is still competitive. And I think that largely is because the polling system as we know it is not, in fact, as accurate as we otherwise might think. Here's the head-to-head matchup between Josh Stein and Mark Robinson in the state of North Carolina. If anyone ever asks you why you may not trust the polls, I'd ask you to direct them to this page here of a 2024 North Carolina governor matchup between Mark Robinson and Josh Stein. Because voters in the state of North Carolina do not approve of Mark Robinson. And yet the average here seems to suggest that 18% of the state is largely undecided. While governor elections are very infrequently polled, I mean, they aren't the most polled or most covered or whatever it might be type of election that people are focused on in a presidential year, they still matter. And they can still have up-ballot effects, meaning they can positively impact either President Biden or former President Trump. But right now, with Josh Stein being ahead by 0.2%, it isn't all bad news for Democrats. Donald Trump currently leads Joe Biden by 6.7% across the state, and so you're seeing roughly a 7-point swing between the North Carolina governor election and the presidential election. But overall here, Josh Stein, I can tell you with full certainty, is far ahead more than 0.2%. And I'm reminded of the 2022 governor election in the state of Pennsylvania, that at this point in time 2 years ago, if we were to look at the July 5th numbers, Governor Josh Shapiro, who was then the attorney general, the parallels here are quite interesting, then attorney general, was ahead of Doug Mastriano by just 2.9%. Now, here's what I know. Back then, we knew Doug Mastriano was as extreme and far right as he ended up being on election day. He made comments very similar to the one we saw Mark Robinson make very early on in the race. And yet, nobody seemed to care. It seemed that this governor race was going to just happen to be competitive because Pennsylvania was a state that Trump won in 2016 and Biden won in 2020, and neither of them won by more than 2 points. And so it was fundamentally a swing state, and so it would be, until it wasn't. Until more people started to realize Doug Mastriano attended January 6th. We knew this going into the primary. The Democratic Governors Association funded Doug Mastriano's campaign. You heard that correctly. The Democratic Governors Association and Democrats nationally funded Doug Mastriano in the primary. Why? Because he was a January 6th attendee, state senator running for governor. Donald Trump backed him, and what happened? He ended up losing. But in the early stages, nobody knew, or it seemed like nobody knew. The early polls suggested that this race again was going to be exceptionally competitive, despite it very much seeming like Josh Shapiro was on track for a very solid victory. But we looked past that. In all of my 2022 governor election ratings, I almost always had Pennsylvania as a likely blue state, even at times where the polls suggested that Josh Shapiro would win by just 2 points. Well, fast forward, the polls started to expand because the Democrats did a very good job at characterizing Doug Mastriano for the person that he was. He may be someone that you agree with on policy or disagree with policy, but the Democratic Party really only elevated the comments that he made. The same thing we are seeing now. Yes, Mark Robinson said some folks need killing. Yes, Mark Robinson also said a lot of the other things that he's being accused of. A lot of these news articles aren't being birthed out of nowhere, but because this is probably one of the worst GOP picks Republicans could have across the country, and there are detrimental impacts of doing things like this. Remember Trump's picks back in 2022? Just 10 of them out of the 21, where he had risky picks, meaning he endorsed someone in a swing state. We're not looking at, safe seats. We're not looking at safe Republican seats where primaries were the consideration here. We're looking at general elections. 21 races that were rated by Politico as competitive, as risky picks. Less than half ended up winning. When it comes down to the Senate races here, in the toss-up races, Ron Johnson was the only one who won. Dr. Oz lost. Blake Masters lost. Herschel Walker lost. He got it right with J.D. Vance and Ted Budd, but both of them had closer races than what it should have been. Ron Johnson was the only real strong performance there, and even then underperformed the polls by 3 to 4 points. When it came down to the House races, in none of the lean Democratic seats did his candidates win. In none of the toss-up seats did his candidates win. And just 6 out of the 7 in his lean Republican column ended up winning. Why does this matter? The problem here is that we are back in this toss-up column, where only 1 Senate seat went to him and 0 of the House seats went to him. In the governor elections too, I'm surprised they're not covering this too, but you can see it in the governor's races. We can go ahead and take a look. Places like Josh Shapiro, where Donald Trump handpicked the nominee there. Kari Lake, where Donald Trump handpicked the nominee here. You can see it. Didn't endorse Brian Kemp. That was a big thing. Brian Kemp still ended up winning. Derek Schmidt, Trump's pick in Kansas, lost. Paul LePage, Trump picks in Maine, lost. Tudor Dixon, Trump's pick in Michigan, lost. Joe Lombardo was the only real success here for Donald Trump. In New Mexico, lost there. Lee Zeldin, lost. Kristen Drazen, lost. Doug Mastriano, lost. Greg Abbott was in a safe red state anyway, did well, but his narrowest performance of any election that he ran with. And Tim Michels, endorsed by Trump, lost. Donald Trump doesn't have a good track record because the company that he keeps, in terms of who he endorses, often comes embroiled in scandal. And while that was something that was not a problem for him, remember all the scandals Donald Trump came into in the 2016 election? None of that seemed to matter to the swing state voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The 3 states that without them, Hillary Clinton would be running for, finishing off potentially a second term or would have ran for a second term in 2020. Mark Robinson represents a lot of what the Republican Party really tries to push away. But that is also his big problem. They love him, but they hate what he stands for, seemingly on the national level. They reject all of these things on an individual basis when you ask them, do you support that anybody supports that needs killing? No. Do you believe that women should have kept their skirt down when you talk to them about abortion? No. But when it comes down to the candidates that they back, the answer is yes. That's our guy. He's going to be the one who takes on the Democrats in North Carolina and wins. Newsflash, he won't. Again, I look at these 2024 polls very often with a grain of salt because I feel very jaded after the 2022 midterms where I was sold on this promise, a promise that I led into and believed wholeheartedly that the polls never underestimate Republicans. And I did think that there were some individual states, right? Nevada was always one that underestimated Democrats. I believe this idea that they never underestimated Democrats, I rather meant to say. Nevada was one of the states where I thought that was an anomaly, but I didn't think it could happen to the scale that it did in 2022. And so now the same pollsters are coming out and saying, all of a sudden, these races are back to being just as competitive. Well, I genuinely do not like that narrative because I don't think that it is true. You look at the things that the Republican Party has now associated with them in North Carolina. And while I do think Trump does lead Biden in North Carolina, in no reality is Josh Stein just winning by 0.2. We are seeing a very similar scenario to what we saw with Shapiro and Mastriano in that the race at face value might seem competitive. And because voters don't know as much about Mark Robinson between, the time the poll was taken and the months leading up to it, because we aren't in the full swing of the general election season. But we're about to be. After Labor Day is when voters really start to become very politically cognizant. That is what we've known about American politics, is that it's those final 3 months of the campaign season that are make or break for any presidential campaign. And so it's those times where Democrats really get into crunch mode. Republicans really get into crunch mode. And in North Carolina, they don't have much to campaign on. Mark Robinson has fully embraced many of the comments he has made. Even Donald Trump shies away from some of the more extreme things he is caught saying on tape, some of the more extreme things he's caught saying on Twitter, some of the more extreme takes he's had in decades past. Mark Robinson is unapologetic. Even in the statement he made yesterday saying that some folks need killing, he said some liberal out there is going to be upset. Now, I'm not looking at this from a partisan lens, but I can tell you, I think there's far more than just liberals who don't like language like this. This is not the language becoming of somebody who should be the next governor of North Carolina at face value. That's what voters are going to look at here. And it damages the Republican Party up and down the ballot. Because I remember the Pennsylvania governor's race for a reason, because Josh Shapiro largely helped people like John Fetterman get across that finish line in the Senate race in Pennsylvania. Now, John Fetterman likely still would have won against Dr. Oz, but it certainly helps when you have a down-ballot governor's race doing very well, where voters are getting out there and saying, I'm excited to vote for Josh Shapiro on the governor's level because Doug Mastriano is so crazy. That is how many voters approach this election. And as a consequence, the Republican Party built up this brand identity, an identity that they were too extreme, very often focused and associated with President Trump, very often associated with the more extremist values. And now with all this conversation around Agenda 47, around Project 2025, Republicans are not in a position where they can argue that their plans and their proposals are not extreme. Because Democrats are winning the messaging war when it comes down to party platforms. Democrats very clearly have a more popular party platform, and that's because people like Mark Robinson exist. This association, and Donald Trump has done many rallies with Mark Robinson, this association could do damage to Trump in North Carolina. He is right now pretty much benefiting from the fact that President Biden is unpopular nationwide and down in the head-to-head polls against Donald Trump in the head-to-head matchup when you come down to just the national level, running about 4 points better than what Trump is doing there. But, when you look at that, you say, North Carolina at some point, depending on the trajectory of this race, if Biden is to make up ground, does well at the second debate, does well at the convention, these are things that are very real realities. If this happens, North Carolina could go back into play. Now, I do think we will still find that Republicans win North Carolina on Election Day this November in the presidential race. And the governor's race is entirely different. I'd also look at it from the lens of things that matter far outside of just the presidential race. The state superintendent race, when you have a Republican there who called for the public execution of former President Obama. I kid you not, look into it. It is real. It has happened. It was leaked. These are problems with the North Carolina GOP, and they have yet to confront it here. With all these calls of President Biden to take a step back because of the things that are happening outside of his circle, Mark Robinson is directly responsible for the entire reason why he will lose. At face value, a lieutenant governor who won back in 2020 because of no media scrutiny on the race should do well in a governor's race because of the fact that in theory they should be vetted. In theory they should be strong. In theory they should have the governing experience for voters to feel comfortable with them being the next governor. But it is point after point after point that makes him seem so unlikable and makes him uniquely so unelectable in an otherwise very competitive battleground state that Republicans almost always win. We are seeing flashbacks to what we saw in 2022 in some of these states, and North Carolina is a perfect example. A race that in theory should be competitive, that the polls are suggesting and promising to us is in fact competitive. But when Democrats end up winning here by 5, 6, 7 points, we will have known for months now that Democrats were never going to lose this governor race, and that the decision to nominate Mark Robinson was what put the final nail in the coffin for Republicans in the governor's race in North Carolina. Because Democrats have had 8 years of Democratic control in the governorship. 8 years since 2016, since Trump won the state against Hillary Clinton by 4 points. We saw the Democrats win the governor's race then. Trump won it again in 2020. Democrats won. Now in 2024, Trump will probably win it. Democrats will also win it. And yet we are being told this story and sold on this idea The Democrats are somehow just ahead by 0.2%. I promise you, I don't believe it. I don't think you should either. And we will see that this is likely, and I believe this because we've seen it happen, and this feels like a very interesting story, that we are finding Democrats just narrowly ahead in a race that probably should be far more pro-Dem. And I think we will see that. I think I will be right on this, and I think we can see it on Election Day. I'm getting redundant because I am trying to say all, but I promise you that it will happen because American politics is so weird that things can happen completely outside of our expectations. But this is how I see the race right now. With the recent comments from Mark Robinson, I don't have faith in him if I was a Republican. If I was looking at this from the North Carolina GOP's front, I would have considered a far better nominee from the earlier on stages. But obviously, that doesn't end up happening, and replacing a nominee doesn't often happen, thinking about everything else in context. North Carolina right now, Republicans are not going to win. Mark Robinson was the wrong guy for the wrong moment, for the wrong time. He's not going to win against Josh Stein. This race has been pretty strong for Democrats. Recent comments today only solidify an even stronger victory for Democrats down the ballot. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of your screen, there's a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. There's a video that you can go ahead and watch, and a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.